It's 3 o'clock. I just want to welcome all of you to BTSS talk. Yeah. Yeah, it'd be nice if we all show um our video first so that we can take a group picture. Yeah. Yes. And we also have Junpong. The rest of you are still shy. Okay, never mind. Maybe when more of you join, we can take our group picture. All right. So I just want to welcome everyone to this important talk that we're having today. And I would like to thank our guests very much for being here today. Okay. So I just like to call out a few names to try my best to get everybody to turn on the cameras. Erilyn, are you there? Can you please turn on your cam? And Tommy as well, can you please turn on your cam? Yeah. So that, so that we can take a nice group picture. Yes, thank you. And HM, is it Hang Ming? All right. Now everybody just look here. Smile and say Happy Labor's Day. Okay, I got the picture. All right. Great. Okay. So let me stick it somewhere first. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, now that I've done this, okay, let's move on to our talk proper. I'll start by sharing screen. Okay. So here you see this is a picture of all of you. Okay. Not bad, huh? Right. Okay. So I'd just like to start our talk today. This is a special event that we have put together, a panel discussion for the clinical trials for GBM patients. And before I even start, let me just give you an overview of the brain tumor landscape in Singapore. We are definitely a rare condition, and even though we are rare, we are by no means an easy condition to maneuver. And based on our hospital statistics that we have shared, we have approximately 500 adults and 40 children in Singapore undergoing brain tumor surgical treatments. And the most common type of brain tumors are actually not the primary brain tumors like GBM. It's actually cancer that spread from other kinds of cancer in the body. So the metastatic brain tumors actually account for 20%. And what we are talking about actually the primary tumors when we talk about GBM, etc. So there are about 130 different types of brain tumor, and we know that not all brain tumors is cancerous. But we know that a primary brain tumor that is cancerous, that 50% of primary brain cancers represent are actually the glioblastoma, the GBM. Okay. So today we have a panelist of esteemed doctors who sit on our medical advisory board. And I'm always very grateful for the doctors for taking time already from their very busy schedules, especially, public hospitals now are going to take up 70% of the patient care in Singapore due to the restructuring of our insurance system in our healthcare. So it is wonderful that indeed they've taken the third day of our Labor Day weekend to be with us. So I would like to welcome Dr. Kevin Chua. He's no stranger to us. He's been supporting BTSS for a long time. And also Dr. Yvonne Ang from NUHS. She's also no stranger to us. And finally, someone who is new, but very involved in research for a potential clinical trial that we're looking at. And Dr. Sarah Ho, who is with the NUS Medicine. Okay, welcome all of you. Okay, why this panel discussion? When my mom was sick with brain cancer, I was getting very concerned that the standard protocol of care that were used to treat GBM patients, usually that means a craniotomy and then followed by chemotherapy and radiotherapy, it didn't seem to be working for her because the tumor seems to grow back really fast. So I was just hoping for a cure. And at that point in time, I remembered hoping against hope that there would be a clinical trial that will offer that beacon of hope for her. And after that, as I served in BTSS, I found that this is the same hope that many, many patients and caregivers hold on to. When all else fails, what can we have? So we all hope for a clinical trial. And just yesterday, I was watching the movie Ripples on Netflix. I really like that movie. It's about a group of friends. And one of these friends who found themselves actually was diagnosed with lung cancer. And unfortunately, his lung cancer was very severe and he needed to get into a clinical trial. So the movie depicted that, he needed to get into this clinical trial in Houston. And there's only one place, and there were two patients who were friends vying for the same spot in Houston. So that little girl was chosen to be the trial. And so her family was like, when they heard that she got into the trial, they were, and then they hugged each other, they were so happy, like, oh, she got into this trial. And then that guy who didn't get into the trial was like, like sad, and like, alas, all hope is gone. And I just felt that it basically seems to us patients and caregivers that a clinical trial is the answer to our tired journey of searching for a cure. A clinical trial is the pinnacle of hope for many of us, and I found as I navigate brain tumor cancer with many, many patients and caregivers, in fact, many patients have actually perished in clinical trials. And the idea that I had in the movie, from the movies, is actually not true. So I think, somehow mainstream media perhaps have given us a false understanding of what clinical trials is. And given the fact that in Singapore right now, we have already 2 and potentially 3 trials coming up for GBM patients, we must know what clinical trials are really about so that we can make the informed decision about whether or not we should enroll in a trial and even which trial and what our expectations should be. Okay, so that's basically forms the reason why I'm having this discussion. And our discussion will center around, of course, the topics of objectives, ethical and safety, standard of care as first choice, criteria for selection, as well as compassionate access. So even before we moved on, I just want to have a show of hands, if you do know, that, in BTSS website, we have a page that's called the Glioma Treatment Guide. And on this page, there's a section that has clinical trials available in Singapore. How many of you know this? Please raise your hand if you know about this, okay? Raise hand if you know about this. If you don't know about this, raise hands. Okay. All right. Where are my reactions? Oh, Junfeng, you know about it. Fantastic. I'm so happy that you know about it. This is fantastic. Yeah, correct. So I'm just going to run through all these as an overview. And then at the same time, we're going to get Sarah to talk about this trial for which she's trying to get approval for. It's also for GBM patients. And then we will mention something about this and Genie. I know many of you are excited about it. We will talk about it, and then we will have our discussions around these 5 trials, not specifically about these trials, but the approach that we should be adopting as patients towards these 5 trials. Is that okay, everyone? Okay, so let's start. If you go into this particular website, you notice that we have listed down 3 treatments, clinical trials. And I have arranged for Dr. Ang Beng T, Professor Ang Beng T already, to meet us to talk about his Act 001. Okay, so if you recall, this trial was recently approved, and listen up, is conducted in NNI. Okay, it's in NNI and NCCS. They're all under the SingHealth group. All right. So in order to be eligible for this trial, you would need a sample. You need brain tissue. And it also requires you to have a relapse glioma. In other words, when you do an operation on your relapse GBM, you need to take a sample to see whether you would qualify for this particular trial. Trials have been ongoing in the United States, and it found that, the ACT-001 seems to be quite promising in GBM patients that have this signature of STAT3. So when you remove a sample for testing, is to see whether or not your sample has a STAT3 signature. Because if you have that, then it improves the chances of you getting into this trial. Got that? Okay. So I will stop at this point. Any questions from you all? If you have a question, just raise your hand and ask. Oh, okay. All right. Now, the continuation of proof of concept study, I'm going to ask Yvonne. Now, this is an NCIS study, and Yvonne will tell you a little bit about this thing, but again, an overview only.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. So basically, this is what we call our QPOP study. So what we do is that in patients with newly diagnosed GBM, so at the point of their first surgery or biopsy, we would take the tumor and send the fresh tumor to the lab, where they would then grow the cells so that we would have a sustainable sort of cell line that we can use to test. Then what they do is that we would test different combinations of chemotherapy. So we're actually using, old chemotherapies that have been on the market for a long time. But the purpose of this trial is to look and see which combinations of these old therapies might be the best for each individual. So when we test these combinations, it's then run through a platform called QPOP, which gives us predictions on what we think will be the efficacy of all these different combinations, both like double agent combinations, triple agent combinations. And what this does is it gives us options to use in future lines of treatment. So these patients will still get standard treatment in the first line, which for GBM tends to be chemotherapy together with radiation therapy. But the results of the QPOP panel can then be used to consider as options beyond the first line therapy when the disease recurs.
Okay. All right. So they have been using this technique, or rather this protocols already for some patients, right, Yvonne?
Yes. So this study is recruiting. We have quite a number of patients who we have generated QPOP results, but then it depends on the situation when we reach a point of relapse, whether or not there is a suitable result that can be used, whether the patient is well enough for us to use that result at that point in time.
Okay, yeah, that's right. And from what I hear from Yvonne's her detailed presentation, this is really personalized to each patient. It is not like a standard approach, because they do a very, very thorough study of, your genetics and what have you not, your molecular structures, and then they will find which drug works in best combinations for your type of GBM. Okay, right. Thank you, Yvonne. Right, and now we're going to explain ONC 201, and we have Dr. Kevin.
Thanks, Melissa. So maybe, just to give you a brief introduction of ONC 201. So this is the Acton study and contrast with the earlier studies. So the earlier studies are what we would call investigator-initiated studies. So these basically come from investigators or, clinician physicians within academic institutions itself. Whereas ONC 201 is more sort of an industry-sponsored study. And essentially what this study is about is it looks at a specific location of glioma. So this is diffuse midline glioma. So it's a specific location, specific type. And also within this subset, they also look for gliomas with a specific mutation. So it has to have H3K27M. So long and short of it is that basically the lab first of all, you must have a biopsy sample, and then on the tissue, they must test for it, and they must be able to find that. Because the drug is really a small molecule that targets that particular mechanism of action. And so within the study itself, so this drug has actually gone through earlier phase studies. They thought it was quite promising, and so FDA had given it accelerated approval. So now it's in phase 3. Phase 3 also means that there is randomization. So what it means is that if you agree to participate in this study, there's a chance that you may get standard of standard care, which is essentially, we complete the radiotherapy, and essentially after that we just undergo normal surveillance, right? Whereas if you are randomized to the experimental arm, then potentially you may receive the drug in 2 different dosing strategies. And so from this, you can tell that essentially, even from the pharmaceutical company point of view, they're also trying to find the right dose. First of all, you have the standard arm, so they don't really know whether this works. And then even if it works, they're also trying to find the right dosing to get the most benefit with least side effects and so on and so forth. So within the composite study, I mentioned some of the eligibility criteria. For instance, there are also patients who are excluded, right? So say if you finish radiotherapy and after that you're found to have new lesions outside the radiotherapy field before recruitment to this study, then you will not be eligible and so on and so forth. So there are different considerations, but essentially the take-home message is that this is an industry-sponsored trial. There's randomization, and they are also very particular about which patients will be eligible to participate. Yep.
Okay, all right. So we stop here to see whether there are questions from our audience on this ONC 2001. Okay, very good. So far, it looks like we're fine. Now we're going to ask Sarah. She is trying to get approval for this, right?
Yeah.
Getting approval
We
for
are
this. Yeah.
Yeah, we have been talking to HSA to get this therapy for phase 1 clinical trial in Singapore. Actually with Dr. Yvonne to look into investigator-initiated trial at NUH. So we've been talking to HSA for close to 1.5 years now. They have now accept all our proposed studies design as well as manufacturing design. So now we are working on completing some of the testing that's requested. Then we will submit the dossier for clinical trial application. So the timeline is that we are looking into submitting the dossier around October. Hopefully we then can get approval in 2 to 3 months and start the trial next year, early next year. Now, what we are doing is an innovative therapy. It's a cell therapy. We use stem cells, mesenchymal stem cells, as a car, like a vehicle, to put the drugs in. And this car, we can then plant into the brain following resection of the tumor. So it's an adjuvant therapy, meaning it assists the existing standard of care, whereby when you have recurrence, you need to do resection. And that's the opportunity window that will plant the stem cells around it. So these stem cells, when they are in a resection site, it serves as a biofactory. That's you have 7 days that the cell will continue to make the drug. So what does this drug do? Firstly, it stops the tumor from growing because resection will never be able to get 100% of the cancer cell removed. So we are using this biofactory to make drugs to stop the remaining one from growing. That's the first mechanism. Second mechanism is that it will release a factor that draw your immune system in, and your immune system will then be trained to target the cancer cell. So by that, we hope to achieve a long-term effects that your body start to fight the cancer cell itself. So that's the concept of therapy.
Okay, yeah, that sounds really exciting because of the two mechanisms. First of all, you stopped the cell from mutating and growing, and then you also have a continued sustained effect of fighting of the mutation. Okay, that sounds really good. Are there questions from the audience? Oh, good. All right. We have quite a lot of people online already. Very excited. Thank you. And then, of course, ever since Jason Collins came to Singapore, we all heard about this angenic IC. Okay. Angenic basically means something. Enter gene into what's that, Kevin? I can't remember. I just know like enter gene.
I'm sorry, I can't help you there. I just know it's
Okay, but
angenics.
yeah. But they use a nanocells technology as well to penetrate the blood-brain barrier, if I remember correctly. So they deliver the chemo drug on a nanoparticle carrier or something like that to enter into the brain, you see, and that's basically the whole idea. So the particular drug is not just used for brain cancer, it's also had certain experiments done with pancreatic cancer. Not very successfully though, but it seems to have slightly a little bit more success for GBM patients, okay? So what is the stage of this right now, okay? What is the stage? Are we going to have an angenic trials in Singapore? I will ask Dr. Yvonne Ang to give us an update.
Yeah, so obviously angenic is something that is very exciting to many people. And we are currently, in the process of, talking with the company and trying to get an angenic trial for GBM patients set up in Singapore. This will likely be something in the recurrent setting as opposed to in the first line setting. Yeah, but it's still in process, so we don't currently have a trial, but we hope to get one in the near future.
Okay, all right. So at this stage, again, any questions from you all? I see, can I just check the chat? Okay, right. So let's move on to the next slide, which is, okay, yeah. Okay, now we're going to start our discussion then, okay? So let's start our discussion, and I also want audience to know that if you have a question, please share your question in the chat. Don't feel shy, because that's the whole idea. We are gathering together to have this very important discussion, because we don't know when you will face a relapse. So far, if you notice, all the trials that we talked about have a common criteria, and that it is a relapse tumor, right? There is no like newly diagnosed. So if there's one commonality between all these trials, is that it's a relapse tumor. So what happens if the relapse happen? What are your options going to be? So this talk is supposed to give you the education that you need to empower you to move to the next steps that are ahead. That's why I don't want you to be shy and hold back, because it may actually concern a decision that you have to make later on the road. That's not going to be an easy one, okay? Right? So no question is too stupid or too shy to ask. Just share the question in the chat. And then if I ask you to, if I ask you to share more reasons why you're asking this question, etc., please show your video. It's easier for us to talk to you. But I also like to qualify that today is not a consultation. We are just sharing our advice, me from a lived-in experience point of view, and the doctors from the clinician's perspective about how you should approach clinical trials, so that we do not pin hopes that are not realistic for clinical trials, but we understand what they are for what they are meant to be. Okay, so this is what we'll do. Okay, let's start our first question. Now, why do we have clinical trials? As a lived-in patient, clinical trials represent a potential for miracle to me for an answer to a disease that I haven't been able to find a solution to. But I'm sure that clinical trials exist not just for novel treatments that potentially could save and reverse a patient's life and quality of life. What are some of these reasons why we have clinical trials? Over to you, panelist.
So I guess, as you say, we are still very far from finding a solution to many of our brain tumors. And I think clinical trials are an important way for us to, to explore whether new treatments are going to be helpful and should be added to our arsenal of standard treatments for patients. So I think, a variety of things happen. And actually, there have been a lot of new treatments in, GBMs and in brain tumors that have been tried over the years. But unfortunately, although they may seem promising in the early stages, when they reach the clinical trial stage and they're compared against our standard treatment or compared against even placebo, it's found that these may not necessarily be beneficial. And they may also carry toxicities, side effects that may, that may not be acceptable. So that being said, I think it's really important to have this clinical trial process to test all the new treatments that are coming up to see whether there is something that, that will actually be beneficial to add on to our standard treatment or eventually even replace our standard treatment. So that is really the purpose. For patients on a personal level, I think clinical trials do give people the opportunity to be exposed to experimental treatments that haven't actually been proven. But in the absence of other good options, it's still a chance. There is still hope when you go for a novel therapy that it may be something that works for you.
Okay.
Uh,
Yes,
and
Kevin.
yeah, so perhaps I may add as well. I think beyond sometimes we think of clinical trials and we always associate it with innovative new treatments, but it's not always that. I think sometimes there are different types of clinical trials and clinical studies as well. So, for instance, there are clinical trials looking at innovative forms of imaging to see whether we can beat current standard of care, which is MRIs. And so, you could have basically smaller studies where essentially some of these newer imaging techniques are tried out to see how they compare. On the other hand, I'm sure everyone has heard of proton therapy. So to share, for instance, all cancer patients who undergo, or all brain tumor patients who undergo proton therapy in Singapore are all recruited to an ongoing prospective clinical registry study. And the aim of that is really for us to track outcomes over time and compare it with standard of care, which is essentially IMRT and IGRT, and to see, actually, we all think that the newest, fanciest, expensive toy is always the best modality of treatment, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. And so the idea of essentially collecting this data prospectively is to allow us to have the data to then form these objective comparisons. And so, I think hopefully at the end of today, you appreciate that essentially, clinical trials are all encompassing and involve everything from diagnosis all the way to treatments to surveillance and so on and so forth. Yep.
I just like to add that sometimes clinical trials may not involve treatments. It may be for data collections to understand the cancer better. So we may collect tumors and that may not have treatments, but the tumors will then be studied for the genetics itself, or it can be developed into models to explore new therapy. So that can be also crafted as a phase 1 a clinical trial for the research itself. Or there are clinical trials that is meant for optimizing existing protocol. They may change the durations, they may increase the dose, reduce the dose, or they may introduce or repurpose drug. And those kind of trials can be designed accordingly as well.
Yeah, and personally, I'd like to share as well that I've come across clinical trials that patients go to, which are merely to test, the tolerance of pediatric patient to a particular drug. That means what is the maximum tolerance? So I just want everybody here to be very clear that there are numerous reasons why we have clinical trials. They are not necessarily therapeutic. they could be investigative in nature, right? And so for example, the one that the little girl did is investigative in nature, like they want to see how much she could tolerate of this drug. Then the whole process of requiring her to do a biopsy, resulting in facial paralysis, etc., it's really quite traumatizing, of course, to the patient as well as the family. Then in the end, the patient did not survive as well, you see. So I think one of the first things we need to be very clear about is what is the objective of this trial. Okay. And now perhaps it's good for us to clarify how does a clinical trial come into being? Because many times as patients, we hear that, oh, it's in a 1A, oh, it's in a 1B, oh, it's 1C. It sounds like primary 1A, B, C. Oh, it's 2, that kind of thing. So maybe give us an overview, of how a clinical trial come into friction. Yeah.
So I guess, Melissa, when you're talking about, 1B, 2, 3, we're talking about the phases of the clinical trials. And
Yeah.
so we're just talking about perhaps a therapeutic, say a product. Usually these drugs are developed in different phases. So you don't usually go straight ahead to a later stage trial, like a phase 3 trial. You would normally start in the earlier stages, and the goals in each stage are different. So in phase 1, really the purpose is not so much to see whether the drug works as just to establish whether and at what dose this drug is safe in humans. So usually these are quite small studies where they will give, a little, like a set low dose of the drug. They'll give it to a few people. And if it's tolerated well, then they will escalate the dose to, to a higher dose and a higher dose to find out which is a good dose to then progress to larger numbers in a trial. So then a phase 2 trial continues to look at the chosen dose in terms of safety as well as in terms, starting to look at efficacy. But a lot of times to get a drug actually registered and for it to come onto the market and be approved, it then requires a phase 3 trial, which then puts it head to head in large numbers of patients, often hundreds of patients, the standard of care versus the new therapy that is coming up. And then that's how drugs get established. So even our standard, for example, we all say, STUP protocol, right? GBM, we give chemo plus radiation, followed by, a period of adjuvant chemotherapy. That was something that was established in the phase 3 trial because about 20 years ago, the standard was really radiation alone. And then they found that the addition of chemotherapy to the radiation improved survival in patients. So that's how our practice sort of evolved based on clinical trials.
Wow. So how long is this entire process, like starting a clinical trial from phase 1 to test tolerance all the way to phase 3, where they are considered for, like drug available for public consumption?
It can be very variable, but it is often a years-long process because you can imagine even to set up a clinical trial with hundreds of patients, to recruit those patients, then you need to, on the treatment, monitor them long enough that you have data on their life expectancy, on their prognosis, on their treatment. So it depends on which treatments you're using and what disease we're talking about. Because there's some diseases where the natural life expectancy is really long. Then you're waiting for a very long time for data to actually mature. Where life expectancy is shorter, maybe a bit shorter, but it is a very long road, from the development of a drug in a lab to getting it approved. There are, mechanisms that fast track approval and that sort of thing, but in general, quite long. And of the many drugs that go into phase 1 trials, actually the number that actually come out of a phase 3 trial and become part of our regular treatment algorithms, the percentage is actually quite small.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Feel free to add to this, Sarah, as well as Kevin.
Yeah. We are at the preclinical stage. I mean, take our project, for example. We started from the conceptions of the idea of how we design the therapy. The preclinical stage, the manufacturing design development itself is already 10 years. that is to get the product ready to have a phase 1 trial. And the phase 1 will take at least 3 years, for even for glioblastoma, for 3 years to follow up, to recruit sufficient patients, at least 9 to 15 patients for phase 1 trial. And after which, if it's safe, everything looks good, and then you move on to phase 2. When you go to phase 2, you look into efficacy, meaning how well the treatment helped the patients in their conditions. And in that case, you wait for another 3 to 5 years. And for glioblastoma, you may get a fast track to commercialization of phase 3 because it's often drug designations, that kind of thing. So in general, it's about 15 to even 20 years to get a drug out. And not to mention each of the drug behind, there's a patent, and the patent run out in the next 10 years. So everything is very tight when we try to move the new therapy from one end to the other end. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Thank
maybe
you. Yes, Kevin.
just to add as well, I think even after the trial finally gets to the center, to the recruitment center, there's also it basically also has to cross two hurdles. So one is ethical IRB hurdle, which is essentially that the PI has to present this to an ethical board, and everyone must agree that this is a study that has potential benefit and minimizes risk and so on and so forth, as reasonable eligibility criteria. The other thing is that if it's a novel, unregistered product, then usually you will have to HSA regulatory processes as well. So all these require time as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, but the thing is that when it comes to brain cancer patients, the trials that we now enjoy today, in other words, it's something that has been started something like 10 years ago. Am I right to say? Wow. Okay. Right. And obviously, we are coming at an exciting stage where the trials are finally, being considered for approvals. And given the fact that GBM patients have a more limited lifespan compared to other, long-standing diseases and cancer, what is the best approach to decide on which trial? How should we decide? If I was a GBM patient and let's say I've got QPOP, then let's say I also got ACT 001, so how do I decide? Of course, one of these would be the the mutation that requirement, isn't it? Right? The mutation requirement will help me decide. That's one. Yeah. But assuming that there are similar trials, what are some criteria the patient should consider?
That's a really good question, and one that I'm afraid probably doesn't have a set answer. First of all, it depends what trials you may be eligible for at that specific time. And although we are fortunate to have an increasing number of trials for GBM patients in Singapore, the truth is the eligibility criteria is still often strict. The slots available for each trial for a trial at any one time, a slot may or may not be available. So there are a lot of things, although, it's tempting to look at it as, oh, these are all the trials that I have as an option, which one should I choose? It is really a bit more circumstantial, and it's what is available to us at that time. I think if you really were in a situation, I don't think it's common to be in a situation where you have multiple trial options to choose from in a setting of recurrent GBM. And so, but I think if that were the situation, then it would involve, a detailed discussion with your doctor to really weigh up the options, which ones may be more suitable for you, based on molecular profile, based sometimes even on, perhaps the sequencing of treatments. One trial may allow you to go on your trial and then after that another trial, So I think there's no clear-cut answer to that, and it's really what might be available. Unfortunately, we will also have a lot of patients at the setting of recurrent GBM who it may be more often than not that you are not eligible for any of the trials that we have, rather than, oh, there's so many trials, which can we choose from? That would be a fantastic situation to have. But I think in that case, it will be a very individualized discussion.
Okay, so I'm going to put in the first one is, of course, the molecular profile. I think also Personally, I mean, I feel that you also need to understand the objectives of this trial. Yeah. Yeah. Sarah, maybe you like to elaborate on why I say so.
Yeah, I think like the Act 001 that you have just talked about, that one requires profiling and to understand whether the tumor will respond to the drug. So most often, if the drug is targeted therapy, which people are trying to do personalized medicines and all, this relies heavily on the nature of the tumor that the patient have. So if without that, then you won't be qualified and you won't respond to the drug at all anyway. So that will be the first criteria. And then secondly would be the patient's fitness. Of course, because certain drugs carry toxicity. So if especially if it's a molecular drug, actually it targets different area of the body that express the same gene. I mean, even though at a much lower sensitivity, is you still respond to it. So the patient's fitness, I think, I mean, I'm not a clinician, but I feel the patient's fitness and whether the drug will further deteriorate quality of life will be the top criteria that the clinicians will actually look into, because no one wants to deteriorate the minimum lifespan further and giving you a drug that is still at the experimental stage.
Okay. Yeah. All right. For everyone's benefit, if you look at chat, you notice that I have written some notes down, to as we go along this discussion, so that be helpful to you. Right. And Kevin, what other criteria would you add? Like, how should I decide on clinical trial?
I think as Yvonne pointed out, right, I think the perhaps the most straightforward way to go about this is really to speak to your clinician. I think sometimes from the clinician's point of view, it's also about the fact that you know you're dealing with an aggressive disease, and so you don't really have a window of opportunity to try something experimental when you know that there's a chance standard of care could possibly work. And so a lot of times when it comes down to even at any point in the journey, right, just speak to your clinician, just ask, are there any clinical trial options available? And I'm sure they will be happy to volunteer that, yes, these are trials are available, you may be eligible for it, but at this moment, this is standard of care, and essentially, this is the way to go. And I think, that's probably the most sensible way to go about navigating all these different
Yeah.
options. Yeah.
I also like to add that even though you get onto a clinical trial, like what Kevin pointed out for ONCO 221, right? It's the fact that, you may be selected for placebo. It doesn't mean that you get into a study. For sure, you'll be getting the drug. So let me just explain. For example, the Indigo study, that was when we were testing the vorasidenib, right? And then it was like, this study was like oversubscribed, a long, long queue of people, but there were some people receiving the placebo, and there were some people actually receiving the actual drug. And they were trying to compare the side effects, you see, and that's why they were able to come to the conclusion that the toxicity of vorasidenib was really very low, because people on vorasidenib compared very well to the people on placebo. You see, in fact, those of them on vorasidenib actually thought that they were on placebo because they felt very well, right? So that's to explain how toxicity is tested and tolerance is tested. So I'm just trying to say that, sometimes when you register for a study, it doesn't necessarily mean that you be randomly picked to be receiving the treatment. You may be picked to be receiving the placebo, and it's a random process. So there is an element of luck of the draw in this. Yeah.
Yeah,
Which,
and then
which
to
you,
add as well, I think sometimes it's not always obvious to your physician which arm you're on, you're being recruited to, because some of these studies are actually blinded as well. So, I think it's intended to reduce bias, and so whatever results you get from it can be as objective as possible. And so yeah, these are just important things. I think in the day, the important thing to note perhaps is that I think getting involved, participating in a clinical trial is also a type of commitment as well, because in general, you have to, there are a lot of study-related procedures, there are additional blood tests, scans, and even if most times you don't know, but if you do, you almost have to go along with all the different investigational procedures as well. So I think just be mindful of that.
Yeah. So in other words, let's say I find that I'm doing this study and I'm getting very tired, because I got to do so many blood tests. That's why you're in a trial, you don't just take the treatment, but they have to test various benchmarks of your blood, etc., etc. So it would mean a commitment. You cannot say no. You cannot like halfway through, I don't want to do this trial already. I want to switch to another one. Can patients do that?
Oh, I mean, participation in trial is always voluntary, and you can always withdraw at any point. Actually, you can withdraw your consent at any point. But usually, before someone enters a trial, we are quite upfront about what it involves to be in that trial. The appointments that you have to come for, the blood tests that you have to do, which sometimes may be a little, more rigorous than we might do for standard therapy, because you really want to pick up, if there are any unexpected side effects. You want to be able to address them quickly, and so. We do talk to patients about this before they enter the trial to try to reduce the amount of dropouts that you have along the way. Because at the end of the day, another major purpose of the trial, it's great that trials make experimental therapies accessible to treatments, but the overarching hope is that it is to understand whether this new treatment is something that will benefit people, and to do that you have to have an accurate and objective comparison. So we try to encourage people not to just switch around, a better opportunity has arisen, so we'll jump from this trial to another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
So
also,
what?
sorry,
Yes,
just
Sarah?
to add, and also sometimes the trial will have exclusion criteria. So if you have treatments from another trial, you might be excluded from the next trial. So you can't really hop around that easily when you are looking into trying different things, because that might create some sort of you might mask the real effects of the next trial or the previous. So it's not usually advisable to jump around trial.
Yeah. So so I think we have to understand that it's not like, okay, I FOMO. So I sign myself on every trial and see which one accept me first. And then I go to the one that accepts me. Then suddenly the one that I really want has accepted me. And so I withdraw and I join the other one. It's not like university admissions, okay, where you sign up for many and see which is the best offer. It's quite different. So that's the reason, one other reason why we're having this talk as well, to help all the patients and caregiver understand that once you make the selection, it's highly unlikely that you could switch. And you also face the risks of being randomly allocated a placebo, right? And yet you cannot switch, and yet you have a lot of commitments, all right? Yeah.
Although sometimes,
I just like to add also, like, even though you decided finally to withdraw from a trial, under the consent form, there's always a statement to say that you will still be eligible to standard of care. So the hospital will not be, the hospital and the clinician will still continue to take care of you, even though you feel that you just want to drop out of that particular trial. There's an option. It's not like you must stick on to a trial. Yeah.
yeah. So just to add, I think there are occasions where essentially some study designs, when they plan the study, when they statistically calculate what's the effects and everything, they may actually allow for crossover, meaning that at a point of progression, you may then receive the experimental therapy. But this is all pre-planned, all baked into the original design of the study. So at the start of the study, when the clinician explains, during the informed consent process, when it explains the whole study plan to you, I think all this will be made clear to you as well. Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. All right. So let's talk about, let's talk about what happens if you're doing very badly in a trial. Let's talk about safety, right? What happens if you're on the trial and you're doing very badly, like you're vomiting, and you want to stay on the trial, but you are not doing very well?
So again, I think a lot of these things are built into the trial protocol. So we have a system of grading. So not doing very well can either mean the tumor itself is not doing well, so the tumor is getting worse, or the side effects are not tolerable. So for side effects, we have a grading system where the severity of side effects are graded, and then the trial will usually have even from the protocol, so even before the trial is started, there will be fixed guidelines as to what to do when a side effect reaches a certain grade. And at a certain level of side effects, if it is severe enough, then the trial will require the person to come off trial. So either, I mean, there are various things that may happen before that. There may be pauses in the treatment, there may be reduction.
Yvonne, you went mute accidentally.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, there are
That's
things
all
that may happen before that. So things like pauses in the treatment or dose reductions in the treatment. But if the toxicity is very severe and if you have, a life-threatening complication from the trial, then it would not be safe to continue the trial in that person. Likewise, if the disease itself was not doing well and there was proof, for instance, that on the trial the disease was worsening, then there are certain there will be certain rules in the trial that we have to follow as to whether or not you would be required to come off the treatment. So it's very strictly protocolized, actually, these trials, and for good reason, because you're trying to answer that question: is this treatment working? And so it doesn't really give clinicians that much flexibility in doing what you want with the trial treatment. You have to follow the rules.
Okay, all right. Yeah, Kevin or Sarah, anything else to add?
No,
If
just to echo
patients
the
are doing
point that,
badly on the trial, yeah.
just to echo the point that there is a lot of reporting and reporting to IRB, reporting to HSA. So everything is actually quite. I mean, there is a lot of monitoring along the way for patients who participate in clinical trials.
Okay, right. Now, a question that is on many people's mind. For example, when Angenic came on board, right? And a lot of patients would prefer to just go on Angenic, thanks to Kevin, who has actually done the research. Angenic actually means entry of genes into cancer cells. All right. So that's an Angenic, that's what it stands for. So a lot of people who had GBM conditions wanted to skip directly into Angenic, and they don't want to do the standard care of doing a resection followed by radiotherapy as well as chemotherapy. They prefer to move straight into the Angenic based on the positive testimonies that they've been hearing. So is this possible? Why or why not?
So I think perhaps to echo what we've been saying up to this point, Angenic at this point is not it's not a clearly proven treatment for GBMs. Yes, there have been very promising stories, but for it to really be approved and become our standard of care, it would need to go through this whole process of being compared to our standards, of being proven to be beneficial. So I think overall the recommendation would still be for standard of care treatment rather than going for experimental treatment. Because at the end of the day, the full profile of its toxicities, the full profile of its outcomes and benefits is not something that has been defined up to this point. And that's why we're looking into running clinical trials to try to understand that benefit and to prove it. But until it's proven, actually, it is still considered an experimental therapy.
Yeah. And also to echo the fact that, it doesn't mean that standard of care doesn't work for you. Right? So without giving standard of care a chance, you cannot say for sure that the standard of care doesn't work for you. And things are standard of care because we have heard from what the clinicians have shared with us that in order for something to be declared as a standard of care, it takes something like 10 to 20 years. And it's only recently that we've got the drug added to radiotherapy for standard of care for brain cancer patients, isn't it? So in other words, it takes something like 10 to 20 years for something to be accepted as a standard of care. So, in other words, based on scientific evidences, it's still giving the best solution for most patients. And for all you know, some patients respond very well to standard of care, that they do not need to find another option. Yeah, that's possible. So we cannot say for sure that standard of care is not working for you. So if you jump the standard of care route, you are just basically assuming that standard of care will not work for you, but it may, right? So that's another reason I can offer why we have to do standard of care first. And also to reiterate that if you notice all the clinical trials, again, refer to relapse tumors. In other words, you must show that there's clinical evidence that the standard of care did not work for this person. And that's why we have all these clinical trials. Feel free to add on, Kevin and Sarah.
No, I completely agree. I think, one of the key principles behind any sort of clinical trials is always first do no harm, right? So I think essentially we don't want to deprive patients from, treatments that have been established over, many years and decades. I think that's the key thing. Now, of course, we also recognize that these treatments are not always perfect. They have shortfalls, and that's why we are always on the lookout for treatments that are better. But these new treatments do have to be tested in a way that allows us to, be assured that they are at least the same, if not better, than what we currently have. So I think that explains why this whole process seems very convoluted, very long, but it's also intended to also not to also spare patients from harm, basically.
Yeah, I agree with that. The standard of care has, as you have described, has already been proven to benefit the patients, based on large studies and to confirm that that is the science work before it becomes standard of care. Which is why I come back to the therapy that we are developing. Actually, we are trying to develop a adjuvant therapy that's improve the standard of care, meaning that you still go on to standard of care, but we add on a therapy that's have increased the efficacy. So the idea of doing adjuvant therapy has always been assisting whatever that is already available. So I believe that will actually give the patients more benefits because you are writing on something that has been proven. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. That's great. However, I want to ask this question because I feel for all these GBM patients, the window of opportunity for them to receive, therapy that would really help them is really very, very small. And what happens, while we patiently wait for these clinical trials, let's say for Angenic, to come about, and unfortunately the tumor relapse. Is there a way for patients, who already have this clinical evidence that the standard of care is not working for them and that's why they're having a relapse? Are they able to access, clinical trials like Angenic, that are being considered right now, ethical board review, etc., etc. Is it possible based on compassionate access?
So these patients wouldn't be going to clinical trials because the clinical trials, if they're not open, they're not open. I think what you might be referring to is whether or not some of these more novel treatments might be accessible on a compassionate basis.
Yeah.
So that depends on a few things. It depends, first of all, on provision of the drug from whoever is developing it. For example, from Ingenic, whether the company is willing to provide the drug on a compassionate access program. It would also depend on being able to get so first of all, regulatory approval from HSA, for instance, to be able to use that drug. And then also it would have to go through a process of ethical approval within a hospital, to go through like ethics board and that sort of thing to make sure that that everyone is in agreement that the compassionate that it would be warranted to use this drug on a compassionate basis. It would be a relatively high bar to meet, so to speak, because you are talking about using experimental therapy where the benefits are unknown, the toxicities are also not fully defined. And as Kevin mentioned, it's really first do no harm. And so, it would really be a case-by-case situation with a very high bar. I think we would look at things like, after going through, all the regulatory things and getting the drug, it would also look at, whether the patient has really gone through all the other treatments that are readily available on the market before we would consider something like that. The functional, like how well a patient is at that point, because especially if you're talking about using something experimental with potential side effects, you wouldn't want to give it to someone who's already not very strong and you're worried that they can't tolerate the effects of it. And also the person would need to really fully understand the implications, like be able to give their consent. So they would have to have mental capacity, which sometimes can be a difficult thing in our brain tumor patients as well, because as the tumors worsen, it can sometimes affect our ability to make some of these decisions. So usually in that sort of situation, it would then go to our tumor board and then to the hospital ethics board for approval. So it is it's not impossible, but it is quite a difficult thing to do, I think.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Yvonne. Yeah. Kevin, any things to add?
Yeah, I think Yvonne's pretty much covered it. I think even in those instances, it's it's always about also assessing the patient and whether or not at that particular moment is the patient, we call it patient fitness, but really functionally is he able to tolerate some of these treatments, and some of these novel treatments, they're not always they're not always without toxicities, and so that's something to be mindful of. Yeah.
Yeah. So patients, when the tumor relapsed, and of course you try to get yourself into one of these clinical trials that we have already listed. But if it's not possible, then Yvonne, thank you for correcting me. Yeah, you have to go the experimental route. So at this moment, we haven't got a clinical trial for Engenic, and that means you have to try to gain access to this drug on an experimental basis. And for that, you need the HSA approval for sure. So your clinicians or the clinic that's looking after you would have to do the necessary paperwork.